Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we'll discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, which is very pivotal for the upcoming mains examination of 2026, we are going to cover 2 important topics which has appeared in the news. The first is, we'll try to understand the issues and shortcomings which prevails in the Prevention of Children from Sexual Offences Act of 2012 and what are the extraordinary powers of Supreme Court under the Article 142 of the Constitution. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to assess that how the year of 2025 has been the third warmest year in the history of humanity and how it has actually been caused by the significant contribution by the anthropogenic pressure. Then, we'll also provide you the very important value addition. Today's one is very important, covering a lot of schemes. And then ultimately, we'll take up 4 news from the perspective of prelims examination, where we'll not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide you the much important value addition. So stay tuned. Recently, the Supreme Court has directed the government to introduce a Romeo-Juliet clause in the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, POCSO Act, to exempt genuine adolescent relationships from the criminal prosecution which is taking place by their families. The issue which forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of government policies and interventions and the issues arising from it. So what is this Romeo-Juliet clause and why the apex court of the country is directing the government of the day to include this new provision in the POCSO Act of 2012? We will try to decode all of this by first developing the understanding about the premise of the evolution of the POCSO Act 2012. So before this particular act, Prevention of Children from Sexual Offences Act of 2012 was enacted, any such sexual abuse being committed against a children was actually covered and penalized under the provisions of Indian Penal Code of 1860, which had certain implicit and inherent problems. First was that it was very gender specific in the nature. So for example, if there was any such sexual abuse which was committed against a boy or a transgender, then that was not included within the ambit of Indian Penal Code of 1860. As it is specifically mentioned, the sexual abuse being committed against the female gender only. The second issue was that it did not recognize many forms of sexual abuse which takes place. So for example, it did not include non-penetrative sexual assault taken place against a child. So for example, let's say if there is a child who has been molested or groped by an adult, does that particular person had any voice to raise within the provision of IPC 1860? The answer is no. The third issue was that at that point of a time, there existed different laws in our country which basically prescribe different age limit. And thus, there did not existed any uniform legal definition of what constitutes children in our country. For example, if we take up the Right to Education Act of 2009, it basically directs the government to provide free and elementary education up to the age of 14 years to children. So one interpretation of the act could have been that any person who has crossed the age of 14 years will either be considered as an adolescent or can be considered as a grown-up man or woman. The fourth important factor which played a pivotal role in the enactment of POCSO 2012 was India's signing and ratification of United Nations Convention on the Rights of Child UNCRC 1989, which we basically ended up ratifying in the year of 1992. Now this UNCRC has a very specific section, that is section 34. Section 34 provides 2 important directives to all the signatories of the convention. The first is that all the countries shall basically form a uniform legal definition of the age up to which a particular person will be considered as a children. And that suggested uniform age was at least 18 years. The second was that it actually ended up defining all forms of sexual abuse which can be committed against a children, which also included your non-penetrative sexual assault or NPSA. Both of these were entirely lacking in the Indian Penal Code of 1860. Ultimately, the fire to the powder keg was provided by a study which was actually conducted by the Ministry of Women and Child Development and was presented in the front of Parliament in the year of 2007, which actually made a shocking revelation that how 50% of the children, that is almost half of the children at that point of a time in our country, had actually faced one or other form of sexual abuse, thus causing a furor in the government and ultimately pressurizing it to enact POCSO Act of 2012, which actually recognized the gaps in the existing criminal laws and thus led to the enactment of a much more child-centric and gender-neutral framework-based act. For example, now, under the provision of sexual abuse which is committed against any gender, it also includes boys, transgender, and obviously the female gender or girls. It also ends up addressing all kind of sexual offenses, thus including the non-penetrative sexual assault against the children as well, and thus ultimately creates a very strong pillar to protect the demographic dividend of the India. When we say demographic dividend, we basically count the working age population in our country, which currently is almost 68% of the population as per the periodic labor force survey. Keep this in mind that when we say working age population, we consider any person between the age of 15 to 59 years to fall in that category, and thus the children from the age of 15 to 18 years also forms an integral component of the demographic dividend, the demographic dividend which is going to play a pivotal role to make our country Viksit Bharat or a developed nation by the year of 2047 with the objective to achieve a $30 trillion economy. When we have understood the premise of POCSO Act 2012, let's try to understand the stringent provisions of the Act. Keep this in mind that in our country, there also exist stringent provisions for traffic rules also, right? There are traffic signals at almost every juncture, and there exist enough penalty mechanisms to kind of create an accountability for you to follow those traffic lines. Do we follow that? Similarly, there exist stringent provisions in the POCSO Act as well, but there exist a lot of leukemas and shortcomings. We will discuss that one by one. First, let's try to understand the provisions. So, the hands of our children. There exists a section 2, clause D, which define the child as any person below the age of 18 years, and that is something which we are basically being deriving from the UN Convention on the Right of Children 1989. Then there is section 3, which defines the penetrative sexual assault, and section 7 specifically defines the other form of sexual assault, which also includes molesting, groping, or any kind of physical contact which has been established with a children by an adult without the consent of the children with any wrong or sexual intention. So even such molestation or groping can now be penalized or will be considered as a sexual abuse under the POCSO Act of 2012. The section 19 basically establishes the responsibility of reporting of such sexual abuse or the offenses. Who all can report under the POCSO Act 2012? Is it only available for the children who has been molested? No. The family members can do that, right? The parents can do that. The brothers, sisters, cousins can actually do it, as well as such responsibility to report such sexual abuse committed against the children also lies with the school teacher, college teacher, even the NGOs which are working at the grassroots level for the welfare of the children, such as for example, CRY is there, Pratham is there. Why this specific provision of responsibility to report has been actually kind of diluted to such a large diaspora? The reason for that is because the children can actually share such trauma which they have faced, right, only with those people where they can actually confide or confess in care ecosystem, right, care environment with the people whom they are actually comfortable to share this. And the section 21 also lays down the punishment for the failure of such reporting of sexual abuse. Then, what are the stringent penalty mechanisms to punish the guilty? There exists section 24, where the child statement can be recorded at the residence or at any such place of choice which can be decided either by the children or by the parents. Then section 26 specifically lays down that there will take place a medical examination in the presence of a parent or a trusted person, where if there is a penetrative sexual assault or such molestation or groping which has been committed, or if there is any mark on the body of the victim, all of that will be carefully medically examined. Then comes section 33, which actually establishes the special courts for the faster adjudication of any cases which has brought under the provisions of POCSO Act, so that we can actually provide speedy justice to that particular person who has been a victim. Then comes section 29, which actually provides the exception to the presumption of innocence. Keep this in mind. So, what does section 29 of the POCSO Act says? It says when a person is prosecuted for committing an offense of sexual assault against a minor, the special court trying the case shall presume the accused to be guilty, which is basically antithetical to the idea of natural justice. So the natural justice idea says that you shall be considered as an innocent person unless and until you have been proven guilty by the court. However, in this case, if you have been charged under the POCSO Act, you will be considered as guilty unless and until otherwise you have been proven to be an innocent person. Keep all of these stringent penalty mechanisms in your mind, because it will help you to understand the Romeo-Juliet clause further in the discussion. Then comes POCSO Amendment Act 2019, which has set up the highest penalty up to the level of death penalty. Keep this in mind. Also, as we are going to discuss further, that how many of such heinous crimes are actually committed against the children by their family members, by their close kins, or by the known person to them. So that's why there also exists an entire chain of penalty mechanism with different gradation of penalty on the basis of the proximity which you share, the proximity which is shared by the accused and the victim. So for example, real life consideration for court while deciding a bail in the POCSO Act, age of the minor victim, younger the victim, more heinous the offense alleged, age of the accused in this case, older the accused, more heinous the offense alleged, and thus more stringent provision for penalty as well as for the bail. Then comparative age of victim and accused, the more their age difference, the more element of perversion in the offense alleged, as well as the familial relationship. The closer such relationship, the more odious the offense has been alleged, and thus obviously the stringent penalty. Now, some of you might be wondering that how is this even a possibility in a civilized nation like ours? Why a family member would ever commit such an act of sexual abuse against the children? Let's try to decipher this with the use of some data which has been provided to us by the NCRB Crime Report 2023, which actually highlights the status of this silent suffering by the children. So there has taken place almost a 9.2% increase in the crime against children, as almost 1.7 lakh cases of crime committed against the children was registered in the year of 2023. The report, which was eventually published in the year of 2025. The crime rate, 39 cases per 1 lakh child population. Right? It has increased from 36 in 2022. 38% of all the crimes against children actually fall under the provision of POCSO Act. So these are basically the crime where the element of sexual abuse is involved. And keep this in mind. Just look at the downfall of ethical values in humanity, that 762 such victims were actually aged below the age of 6 years. Right? Now, obviously, there cannot exist any excuse, right, for such a large-scale downfall of ethical values in humanity and for such large-scale perversion which lies within the society. However, if you people are approaching this particular issue in your mains examination, you shall actually include some sociological dimensions. Let's try to understand them, that why such malice actually exist in our society and what are the socio-cultural factors for that. The first thing which you can quote is the labeling theory. The labeling theory basically, kind of implies the reluctance which lies within the family member as well as within the children to name and acknowledge the abuse which has been committed as well as the abuser. So now let's refer to some data. The data which has been provided to us by the UNICEF itself, which states that how 3 out of 4 adolescents who have been sexually assaulted were actually victimized by someone they knew. And this was the same issue which was also taken into the cognizance by the Madras High Court, where it said that 96% of the cases which are coming to us under the POCSO, the complaint actually lies directly against a family member. Most child sexual abusers are no one else but the relatives, and thus the court directed the government to actually enact a much more stricter law. Keep this in mind. All of this basically takes place. Why? Because of the issue of labeling theory. So for example, many of the times, right, you might have seen around yourself as well, that as a society, we are actually driven by the false sense or superficial sense of prestige which we have created in our mind, right? The most easiest depiction of that can be the epithet of "Char log kya kahenge." So many of the time when such family members actually end up sexually abusing, molesting or groping such innocent children, even though this issue is actually shared by the children to their family members, the family members try to basically succumb on that issue. The reason for that is that it will eventually lead to what? Distortion of their prestige in the society of which they are part of. Sometimes they also take into the consideration of what will happen to the future of the children, especially in the case of a girl child, right? Let's say, for example, if there is a molestation of girl which has taken place at a very early age, and if the family members gets to know about it, the society gets to know about it, who will eventually get married to this girl, right? Also, many of the times such issue can actually directly translates into the disruption of public order as well. Keep this in mind. That's exactly what took place in the Nainital case of 2023, where there was a 73-year-old man, right, coming from a particular community, ended up molesting a small girl child. That basically led to a public furor and ultimately escalated the situation up to the level of communal riots. So all of these things are taken into the consideration to ultimately subjugate and succumb the voice of the victim in this particular case, deriving from the labeling theory. Second is the social learning theory, where the authoritative figures in the society, they actually abuse the trust, thus normalizing the exploitative dynamics. Major reason for that is the deep-rooted patriarchal and gender power structure, where in our society there still exist men who actually keep them at higher pedestal of a superficial gender hierarchy, which they are mostly deriving from the patriarchal societal structure which has been the part of our culture. And thus they have kind of developed this false, fully conceived notion that how they can actually treat the opposite gender in whichever way they want, many of the time being completely ignorant or neglecting the right to dignified life which has been provided under the Constitution, under Article 21 itself. A very grave depiction of that, you guys might be seeing that on the social media, the issue of consent, where there is a person who is in the news, quite recently, where he basically talks about or basically represents the idea that how the consent of the opposite gender does not matter at all. Why? Because that particular person has kept himself at a very high pedestal of a superficial gender hierarchy, and that becomes an issue. The social learning theory. Also, all of this is actually being rooted or being fed from the lack of symbolic interactionism which prevails in our society, where we have basically created a kind of a taboo around the sexual education itself. For example, if you guys are fond of movies, just recall the older movies, how they used to depict a sexual intercourse taking place by the collusion of two flowers. Or for example, many of you might have witnessed the uncomfortability of your teachers when they used to teach you the chapter of reproduction, right, in your biology classes. In many of the tier 2 and tier 3 cities, such issues, such chapters are entirely ignored itself. Or the lack of discussion which takes place on sexual education within the ambit of the families. How such scenes, or for example, even if the precaution ads actually comes on the news channels, or for example, in between the favorite shows which you are watching, how quickly those are escaped and the channel is changed. All of that has actually led to a lack of symbolic interactionism in our country, thus making people aware about these issues, talk about them, address them within the families, make the children aware about the concept of a bad touch or a non-penetrative sexual assault. The irony is that all of this is taking place in a country where an ancient text was entirely written on the concept of sexual education, that is Kam Sutra, written by Vatsayana and depicted in the temples like, for example, Kandariya Mahadev temple built by Chandelas. Or for example, the country, paradoxically, who also holds the epithet of the most populous country in the world with a population of more than 1.4 billion plus people. So these are the issues which prevails, leading to what? Leading to the childhood sexual abuse, which creates a huge impact on the victims. Like for example, they actually start developing a fear of the opposite gender, having anxiety issues, getting angry on small things or the small stage of discomfort as well. Many of them suffers from depression or hypervigilance, thus kind of creating a distrust in establishing any kind of relationship. Or for example, they develop systematic disorder as well, respiratory issues, neurological issues, gynecological issues, leading to what? Leading to the changes in their behavior itself, ultimately kind of having dysfunctional relationship, aggression, hostility, substance abuse, or for example, indulging in promiscuity, that is establishing multiple relationships to actually kind of prove their worth to the society, because their self-respect has been completely distorted at a very early age itself, causing various kind of psychological issues like insomnia, memory loss, post-traumatic stress disorder, fatigue in their body, irritable bowel disorder, obesity, etc. Thus kind of having a lifetime impact on the victims. So there exist such stringent provisions which we have taken place right within the act, that is POCSO. What are the structural issues which prevails in the POCSO act itself? Let's try to discuss that now. The first is the high pendency of cases which takes place. One of the very simple reason for that can be the overclocked courts which we have, the integrated judiciary system, and the large scale pendency of cases there, and the low conviction rate. Just look at the fast track courts which has been established under the provisions of POCSO Act. Just look at their performance. Total 2.4 lakh rape cases were booked under the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, pending in 764 special fast track court as of the date of 31st January 2023, the data which was provided to us by the Law Ministry itself. Only the overclogging of the courts is not the major reason. One of the reason is also the procedural lapses which actually takes place in the investigation, which is actually committed by the police, where for example they actually lack kind of highly scientific forensic lab which are actually equipped with cutting edge technology to actually kind of establish the recent intercourse which has taken place. So for example, if there is a molestation, bad touch, groping of such innocent child which has taken place, even if there is an eyewitness, how you are actually going to prove that in the court, right? If there is lack of, let's say for example, any CCTV footage for that or something. Second is, many of the time these policemen are actually bribed by the families involved itself to do the rafa dafa of the case, because obviously the distortion of prestige which can take place in the society, and thus there exists a kind of a issue of bribery and corruption here as well. Obviously the no scientific procedure to actually prove the recent intercourse. Then there also exists the issue with the age determination of victim and the accused, which ultimately in a domino effect creates the issue of Romeo-Juliet clause, the criminalization of the teenage love affairs which is taking place. Romeo and Juliet basically forms the protagonist of the tragic love story which was written by the Shakespeare, based in the backdrop of Italy. Romeo and Juliet were basically two star-crossed lovers, right, who met each other, fell in love with each other. But their family was actually having a feud, and because of that, they ultimately got married. But because of the prevailing family feud, they ultimately committed suicide to actually meet in the afterlife. Now imagine that there exists such a couple in our country, Romeo and Juliet. As the luck would have it, either they come from inter-religion or they come from inter-caste background in our society. even these days inter-class issues has also started taking place, right? One person is coming from a rich family, another person is coming from a poor family. Their union take place only in the Bollywood romantic movies, right? And not in the reality, obviously. So when we are discussing this, Romeo and Juliet coming from these two different socio-cultural backgrounds, let's say they ended up establishing a consensual physical relationship, consensual sexual relationship before the age of 18 years. However, their family got to know about their Romeo-Juliet love story which is taking place. And thus, the girl family ended up, kind of booking an FIR against the boy under the provisions of POCSO Act. And is now basically forcing the boy to withdraw from this relationship, right? Kind of have the breakup with the girl. Otherwise, face the stringent penalty mechanism of the POCSO Act. And thus taking place the criminalization of the teenage love affairs. Today's case, right, is also another twist to this tale, where the Supreme Court actually used its power under the Article 142, which we are going to discuss, to overturn a POCSO conviction, noting the victim later married the man as an adult. The court observed that the couple should now be allowed to live peacefully in the society as the spouses. So earlier there was a sexual relationship which was committed before the 18 years, but now eventually because they have got married, and thus basically the Supreme Court directed that okay, now this court will not be considered this case under the provisions of Romeo-Juliet clause. Keep this specific thing in your mind, right? So thus many of the courts, like for example Bombay High Court, has actually directed the government that kind of reduce down this age of 18 years to actually the age of 16 years or the age of consent under POCSO, which is in our country perhaps highest globally, and thus it is high time that our country should take the note of the global scenario and establish a age of consent which can actually kind of precede the age of 18 years. Then to actually discuss all of these issues, specifically the sexual abuse which are committed against the children, there took place a UN Summit for Future 2024, right? Following which, right, there are certain amendments which the government has brought, like for example POCSO Amendment 2019, where under Section 15 Clause 1, any person who stores pornographic material in any form involving a child but fails to delete or report shall be penalized with a jail of 3 years. Section 15 Clause 2 says that if you are found to transmit or display or distribute any such material containing a child in that, you will be penalized for 4 years. And the Clause 3 says that use of any such child sexual exploitation and abuse material, CSAEM, for commercial purpose, you will be penalized or jailed for 5 years. Thus, various Supreme Court directive has provided us a way forward which you can also include in your answer. First is, there shall be a strict responsibility on social media intermediaries to actually make sure that such kind of transmission of such material which contains such sexual abuse against the children shall be completely restricted under the Digital Personal Data Protection Act of 2023. Also, the government shall explicitly define what contain this child sexual exploitation and abuse material and shall list it as an organized crime. You shall treat this creation of such material, including AI-generated deepfake, as the real child abuse and include it in the provisions of POCSO Act. And ultimately include the offender details in the national database on the sexual offenders. The government has taken the cognizance of various such directives and has actually led to the fast rate of disposal under the special courts which the government is creating. So across India, 80,320 child sexual abuse cases were actually registered in 2023, and the special courts actually registered the disposal of 87,754 cases, thus have achieving a national average disposal rate of 109%, which was highest in Chhattisgarh, followed by Delhi, Odisha, Rajasthan, Sikkim and MP. So you can also basically showcase the good initiatives which are being taken by the government. Again, what is this Article 142, under which basically Supreme Court ended up providing a complete justice? So what is Article 142? Right now we are covering this from the perspective of prelims examination. So Supreme Court may pass such decree or make such order necessary for doing complete justice in any cause or matter which is actually pending before it, which shall be enforceable throughout the territory of India. What is this concept of complete justice? So Supreme Court in various judgment itself has said that we are basically the custodian of the Constitution, and thus we have a kind of a directive given to us by the Constitution to actually go beyond the procedural constraint. Thus, if we are not exercising this provision of complete justice, which is provided to us by the Article 142, it may lead to the travesty of justice. And thus, such exercise under Article 142 is actually, kind of done to ensure the observance of due process of law. Two specific case laws which you shall remember. First is Canara Bank case, where the Constitution actually intends to do substantive justice and give primacy to the natural concept of justice. And in the Anil Kumar Jain case 2009, the Supreme Court held that High Court doesn't have constitutional power to do complete justice, right? They should actually, kind of strive for that. But the Constitution has given this specific power to the Supreme Court itself. Keep this in mind. Also, under this concept of complete justice, it has actually led to the large-scale expansion of right to life under Article 21, where the Supreme Court has basically also included the due process of law, where now you people have the right to decent environment, including pollution-free water and air. You have right to privacy, right? There is a specific case which has also been asked by the UPSC in various prelims examination, which actually provided for this right to privacy as an inherent part of Article 21. If you people can comment down that. Third is right to free education up to 14 years of age, which we were discussing, Right to Education Act 2009. Right to free legal aid, to travel abroad, right against custodial harassment, right to emergency medical aid, right of women to be treated with decency and dignity, right? The children also have this right, and the right to information, and ultimately, in a very recent case, Ranjit Singh case, Supreme Court held the right to be free from the adverse impact of climate change. And that basically leads us to our second topic, right? Just try to attempt this question, write down your answers, and we move forward to the next news. So as we were discussing in the previous topic, in the recent case, that is Ranjit Singh case, the Supreme Court has basically held that you people have the right against the adverse impact of climate change which is taking place, the global warming which you people might be experiencing, and the heat waves which you people are trying to survive right now. Now try to understand this. Let's say there is a polluting industry which is basically emitting some greenhouse gases, such as, for example, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas basically act as a kind of a blanket to the extraterrestrial radiation which is actually emitted by the earth, right? Thus kind of, heating up the surface, creating the issue of global warming which is taking place. So do you have the right to go to the court to complain against this industry? The answer is absolutely yes. That is the part of your fundamental right. Deriving from that, the today's article actually showcases the issue which is emerging in the front of the world as well as our country. The article highlights that the prevailing need of climate alarmism which shall take place as the recent year, that was 2025, has actually emerged as the third warmest year in the history of humanity with the highest anthropogenic contribution ever. So, the global warming can take place with various such issues. One of the contributor of that is the humanity-led actions, like for example this polluting industry which releases carbon dioxide emission, as we were discussing. Now let's try to see what is the contribution of this anthropogenic emission. For that purpose, we are basically referring to the article which has been published on the front page of the Indian Express, which basically talks about a specific indicator which is called as Indicator of Global Climate Change, or IGCC study, which is basically an annual study which is conducted by the independent international team of researchers coming from various dimensions, which actually help to update the methodologies which is actually used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So as per their study conducted for the year of 2025, it has actually emerged as the third warmest year on the record, right? So the question which comes in your mind, which was the warmest year? That was 2024. In 2024, so let's say for example between the year of 1850 and 1900, which is considered to be largely the pre-industrial level, the global mean average temperature at that point of a time, let's say, was 0 degrees Celsius. From that, now in the year of 2024, it was actually much more warmer than that global average mean temperature of 1850 to 1900, which is considered as a baseline. It was 1.55 degrees Celsius much more hotter than that. That was 2024. The 2025 the average global temperature was actually 1.39 degrees Celsius higher than the 1850-1900 baseline. Now, when we're discussing that there is a contribution by the human-based activities or anthropogenic pressure, what is the human contribution? Focus here. The total increase is 1.39 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial level. Out of that 1.39 degrees Celsius, 1.37 degrees Celsius has actually been contributed by the human action. For example, there was a release of 56.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide emission which took place in the year of 2025. Based on this study conducted by the Indicator of Global Climate Change, which basically includes more than 60 researchers coming from across the world, as per the 6th assessment report of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world can emit a maximum of 130 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the year of 2026. However, this quota of 130 billion tons of carbon dioxide, let's say for example from year of 2026, till the year of 2100, the world can emit in total 130 billion tons of CO2. If we emit this much of CO2, right, which acts as a kind of a greenhouse gas, we will be able to achieve our target of Paris Agreement which we have set, and that is to limit the global warming up to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the baseline, that is 1850 to 1900. 130 billion ton from 26 to 2100 in its totality. However, as per the estimate by IPCC and IGCC, it will actually, this carbon budget will end up exhausting within the next 3 years or by the year of 2028 itself. And thus, the world is going to breach the Paris Agreement target within the next 2 decades. And by the end of 2100, if we keep on emitting the CO2 with the rate which we are currently doing, let's say 50 to 60 billion tons of CO2 additionally being added to the atmosphere, it will the temperature will end up rising by 3.1 degrees Celsius by the end of 21st century. Right now it is 1.37, and just imagine the catastrophe which is taking place across you. The intensification of tropical cyclone, the heat waves which are taking place, the melting of glaciers, the rise of the sea surface level which is basically leading to the inundation of the coastal cities, small island countries, all of these issues are further going to be aggravated. Now imagine what if we end up breaching the 3 degrees Celsius mark by the year of 2100, and the kind of destruction and catastrophe which it will cause to the world. Also, keep this in mind, our country, as per the recent report by the World Bank, is one of the world's most disaster-prone country in the world. Keep this in mind. Thus, why such nationally determined contributions which we have taken for ourselves to actually curb down the emission of greenhouse gases, to actually kind of curb down the use of fossil fuels, and kind of transition to a much more sustainable energy to become carbon neutral by the year of 2070, when we have taken such nationally determined contributions to ourselves, keeping in mind the Paris Agreement 2015 obviously, why it is necessary for our country? Because there exists the global warming woes for our country as well, where India's mean surface temperature has already risen by 1 degree Celsius from the year of 1950. Specifically after the LPG reforms which took place in the year of 1991. From that, in the last 3 decades, there has been increase of 0.5 degrees Celsius. In 2025, there took place 77 heat wave events, spanning a cumulative of 536 days across the country. Also, as our population is rising, as we are transitioning from an underdeveloped country to a developing nation, and ultimately to have the target of a developed nation, to Viksit Bharat by 2047, don't you think our energy consumption will keep on significantly increasing, right? More number of people are now installing ACs because they cannot survive outside. Don't you think the energy consumption is going to be significantly shoot up in the coming years? That is exactly what is taking place. We are right now the 3rd largest energy and oil consumer. The energy demand is going to grow 2.5 times by the year of 2047. 25% of the total incremental increase in the global power demand will come from one single country by the year of 2047, and that is going to be India. 1/4 of the incremental demand for energy across the world. What if we are unable to transition to the renewable energy resources like, for example, solar energy, hydropower, geothermal energy, nuclear energy, and we keep on producing energy from fossil fuel sources like, for example, oil, diesel, petrol, coal, etc., releasing what? Much more of such greenhouse gases, creating a much more thicker blanket, which will end up warming our country much more exponentially in comparison to other countries. As per the June 2025, the total installed power capacity which we have was 495 gigawatt, from which the coal-based thermal power plants itself contributed to 217 gigawatts as per the installed capacity, but amounted to 71% of the power generation. Keep this in mind. As the temperature will increase, so the cooling demand will increase as well. And India's cooling demand is 50 gigawatt, that is 1/5 of the peak power demand. By 2030, this cooling demand itself is going to shoot up to 200 gigawatt by 2030. Currently, only 6% of the households actually use one or more air condition, only 6%. Imagine if this ratio even increases to 18 to 24%, 3 to 4 times increase by the year of 2030. The amount of energy consumption which will increase, and our huge reliance on fossil fuel based energy, what it will eventually lead to: water scarcity, droughts, flash floods, intensification of tropical cyclones which will take place. And there is another article today itself which is actually linked with this concept of global warming and climate change, and that is the study which is actually showcasing that how the Hindu Kush Himalayas, they are actually going to face drier monsoon, but they are actually facing a much more threat of climate hazard. Now, why this region of Hindu Kush Himalayas are so important for us? Let's first try to understand this. The Hindu Kush Himalaya, they actually cover a total area of 4.2 million kilometer square. So for example, you guys might have heard about that how when the southwest monsoon enters from the region of Kerala, brings kind of precipitation to our country. Why they keep on circulating within the ambit of our country is their collusion with the Himalayas, which actually stop these rain bearing clouds to actually kind of traverses to the region of Central Asia. So don't you think that if these Himalayas or these glaciers will eventually start declining, or their height is going to subside down, that will also have a kind of a repercussion effect on the decline of monsoonal rainfall. Also, these Hindu Kush Himalayas, they cover countries Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar and Bangladesh. These glaciers which has been created over millions of years, they actually act as a feeder source for major river basins: Amu Darya or Oxus River, Brahmaputra, Ganga, Indus, Irrawaddy, Mekong, Salween, Tarim, Yangtze, Yellow River. Remember them from the perspective of the prelims examination as well. The rivers which actually sustains or creates alluvial flood chains, thus providing for large scale agriculture productivity, large scale water sources for various flora, fauna as well as us humans, and thus sustain a population. For example, Ganga itself sustains a population of more than 600 million people. Provides as a sustenance source for various kind of flora and fauna. Exist 4 global biodiversity hotspots, sustaining more than 35,000 of plant species and more than 200 of animal species. But if the temperature keep on increasing like this, just see, if the emissions are contained just like at the level of this, there is going to be 2 degrees Celsius global average warming, but the Hindu Kush Himalayas will face a temperature rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius, and thus half of the ice of Hindu Kush Himalayas are going to be lost by 2100. A very important infographic provided to you by the Down to Earth magazine. Just look at the Himalayan meltdown, where Himalayan region has warmed by 1.6 degrees Celsius, already above the pre-industrial level, much more higher than the global average mean surface temperature increase, and the western Himalayas are nearing 2 degrees Celsius. Don't you think with this increase in the temperature, there is going to be further decline in the glaciers which will take place, which will kind of increase the water supply in the short run, but in the long run it is going to create a huge issue of water scarcity and drought, and this much population of flora, fauna and humanity is eventually going to get impacted. So if our country wants to transition kind of very stringently from these fossil fuel based sources to renewable energy sources, don't you think we require a large scale funding mechanism? We require to have set up for ourselves some nationally determined contribution target to the larger goal of Paris Agreement, and that is what NDCs are. Under the Article 4, right, of UNFCCC, it basically directs the Paris Agreement that the countries must prepare nationally determined contribution to limit the global warming up to 2 degrees Celsius by 2100 and most ideally by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Article 3 state that each country shall showcase progression than the previous one. Article 13 basically, kinds of create an accountability mechanism of the country where they are required to report on the progress which they have made on this NDC. Article 15 basically says, 14 basically says that there shall take place a periodic assessment of the collective progress by every 5 years. And very recently, our country has announced a new target which we have set for ourselves for the year of 2030 to 2035. But to actually achieve these targets, we basically required a large-scale funding mechanism to actually transition sustainably to these renewable energy resources, right? For that purpose also, there exists a large-scale financial mechanism. Note them down for your mains examination. Article 11 of UNFCCC. There shall exist a financial mechanism, right, to actually fund such developing countries, to basically help them to adopt such renewable energy projects, and for that global environment facility was created. Article 11 of Kyoto Protocol basically provided for the establishment of adaptation fund to help developing countries access funds through national institutions. In the Conference of Parties 16th, which took place at the Cancun in the year of 2010, there was ultimately establishment of a green climate fund so that there take place a low emission climate resilient pathways, something called as a low emission long term strategy, which also appeared in your prelims 2026, so that the countries, the developed nations, right, the global north, like for example countries like USA, France, Britain, who have been historically responsible for the industrial evolution and thus large-scale emission of such greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, they shall pull up at least $100 billion annually from the year of 2020 and start directing them towards such developing nation. The Warsaw Conference of Parties 19 at Warsaw led to the establishment of loss and damage fund as well for financial assistance in the case of irreversible damages which has already been caused to, let's say for example, various small island nation. Article 19 basically led to the kind of establishment of a new collective quantified goal where it was decided that the developed nation will at least start pulling $100 billion annually by the year of 2020 and directing them to these developing nations, so that the developing nations can actually achieve their nationally determined contributions, such as for example the one which we have taken for ourselves. For example, previously we had set our target for ourselves to reduce the carbon emission intensity of GDP growth by 45%. Till now, by the year of 2025, we had achieved 36% carbon emission intensity reduction as per of the GDP. But now we have set for ourselves that by the year of 2035, we are going to reduce carbon emission intensity in our country by 47% from 2005 level. Then we said that we will install 50% of our total installed power capacity will come from non-fossil fuel sources. That is something which we have already surpassed. Looked here, right? Currently installed power capacity 52% is coming from non-fossil, right? Now we are saying that we are going to achieve 60% of installed power capacity only from renewable energy sources like solar energy, hydropower, nuclear energy. But the generational power capacity, which is not equivalent to the installed power capacity, keep this in mind. The generational power capacity of renewable energy resources are hardly over 20%. Then we said we are going to add 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide sequestration through mangroves, through creation of forest, etc. However, we were able to create additional sink of only 2.2 billion ton. Now we have set up a target of setting up 3.5 to 4 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. But are we actually kind of indulging in large scale afforestation? The answer is no. As per the SFR report, the total forest coverage in our country, forest and tree cover, is less than 1/4 of total geographical area. However, under the National Forest Policy of 1988, we had said that we will cover 1/3 of the geographical area of our country with the forest and tree cover. Then when we are transitioning toward these renewable energy projects, let's say for example solar energy, it basically requires a large scale capital investment. Do we are getting any kind of funding? The global south is getting any kind of funding from these rich countries? No. These global south is basically termed as have-nots. And they are asking for financial help from these developed countries to actually adopt these greener technology. Why? Because if they are going to do high expenditure on such renewable energy infrastructure, they will end up incurring the fiscal deficit. And thus finance act as a critical component of accelerating the adoption of cleaner technologies. They are saying that many of the countries are coming and they are saying we are going to install renewable energy projects in your country, like for example China in Dizibouti, but they are doing nothing but kind of indulging them in debt trap. Even as per the UNCTAD report, if these developing countries like for example India, if they want to achieve their nationally determined contribution, they actually require a financing of 5.8 to 13.6 trillion dollar. Thus in COP30, right, these developing nations, they basically demanded for finance mobilization of at least $1.3 trillion per year from the year of 2035 to meet their NDCs under Paris Agreement. The developed nations were basically offering 1/4 of them, the global north, which is basically responsible for 82% of the global carbon budget. That is the irony. That's why it was basically not materialized. However, as a country, we have taken adequate steps. Do remember all of them to write in any answer on any question which comes on renewable energy. Like for example, Pradhan Mantri Kusum, where we are basically trying to, kind of install solar energy panels in the process of, kind of creating irrigation infrastructure at the grassroots level. Then Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana, under which we are basically trying to install solar rooftop panels in almost 1 crore households. And for this installation of solar photovoltaic panels, the government is taking care of 40% of subsidy also. Then under National Hydrogen Mission, right, we are trying to produce green hydrogen up to 5 million metric ton by the year of 2030. Then we are also focusing upon waste to energy concept by creating Gobar Dhan scheme, right, where the farmers can actually, kind of add like your cow dung, or for example the woods, or various such, for example agriculture based stock and waste, and then convert it into natural gases to actually increase the supply of such renewable energy resources. India has also joined Global Biofuel Alliance. And ultimately, we have also set up an ambitious target that by the year of 2047, 100 gigawatt of installed power capacity will come entirely from nuclear energy through our 3-stage nuclear program which we have in our country. And this is the specific objective which we have taken under the Shanti Act of 2025. Also, as a way forward, you can write about this concept of high performance buildings which can be adopted. A model which we can actually borrow from global best practices, like for example Singapore as a country, where we can actually install various kind of, let's say for example, afforestation mechanisms within the houses itself to cool it down, to provide for natural ventilation, to actually kind of create mechanism for rainwater harvesting, to actually cover our rooftop with solar panels under Pradhan Mantri Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana. We can also indulge in high-scale urban afforestation to actually reduce down our cooling demand, to actually decrease the heat island effect. So keep all of these suggestions in your mind, right? Try to attempt these questions as well. And we move forward to the next news. For value addition purpose for Mains 2026, today we are going to actually look at the significant achievements which has been achieved by the current government, right? Specifically under the tenure of our Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Why? What is the news? The news is the story of Bharat, which has started running at its full speed for the first time, featured in the newspaper Indian Express on the page number 10, where the Union Cabinet actually congratulated our Prime Minister for becoming the longest serving elected Prime Minister of the country, surpassing the previous record, which was actually held by the first Prime Minister of the country, that was Jawaharlal Nehru, who actually served for 4,398 continuous days from 1952 to 1964. The article basically tells us about some salient achievements of the current government which people can very selectively utilize in your mains answer writing. For example, the Ujjwala scheme, which was actually launched to provide a smoke-free kitchen for the women, which is implemented by the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas through various oil manufacturing companies or PSUs like IOCL, BPCL, HPCL, etc. Remember, it's a fully funded scheme by the central government. It's a central sector scheme. The objective was to provide deposit-free LPG connections to adult women from the poor household, for which they basically get a targeted subsidy of 300 rupees per 14.2 kg cylinder for up to 9 refills per year. And what has been the significant achievement of this scheme? That approximately 10.33 crore Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana connections or LPG connections has been established across the country as per PIB. Where we can utilize this? We can utilize when we are talking about the initiatives which has been taken by the government of India for women empowerment, or when we are talking about to tackle the pollution, to curb down the PM 2.5 and PM 10, which is actually released because of the burning of organic matter. So we have basically replaced it with the use of LPG connection. Also, such LPG connection leads us to energy security in our country as well. However, large scale dependent of such LPG based cylinder has also caused an issue of energy security in the context of supply chain disruption which took place very recently. Keep this thing in your mind as well. Then the article talks or tells us about Lakhpati Didi campaign by the Ministry of Rural Development, which is a centrally sponsored scheme. The objective was to provide skill development, entrepreneurship training and credit support to these women which are indulged in various agriculture sector, allied activities like, let's say for example, livestock, or in handicraft and micro enterprises. The salient feature was to enable such women-led self-help groups to actually earn the income of more than 1 lakh rupees or more. And keep this in mind that by the year of 2025 itself, 1 crore plus women have actually earned this title of Lakhpati Didi status, to have an annual income of more than 1 lakh rupees. And now the government is basically targeting through such self-help groups to create or achieve a target of at least such 3 crore financially independent women, leading to what? Their women empowerment, GS1, or the financial inclusion at the grassroots level. Then Pradhan Mantri Kisan Samman Nidhi. So two major scheme has also been discussed in the newspaper article in the context of farmer. Implemented by Ministry of Agriculture. Remember, it is now a center sector scheme, 100% funding by the government. Objective was to actually achieve the target which was set up by the Dalwai committee, which basically suggested the government to direct or target towards doubling the income of the farmers. So basically the government said that the farmers are incurring a large scale input cost when they are doing cultivation. Let's say this year is supposed to be an El Nino year. What if the large scale drought takes place and the farmer does not reap the benefit of the cultivation which they have done? So to actually provide them a kind of a stable household income, right? Kind of a salaried income, the government basically brought this Kisan Samman Nidhi to provide income support to these small and marginal farmer families. The salient feature is that the farmers are paid 6,000 rupees per year in 3 equal installments, which are basically transferred through what? Completely online, and thus through direct benefit transfer mechanism, which is generated through the JAM Trinity, right? That is your Jan Dhan bank accounts, your Aadhaar card, which is linked with your mobile interface. Now, let's say for example, if in the village there does not exist a kind of a large scale internet penetration, if the farmers are not having in the occupation of, let's say for example, or in the possession of smart mobiles, don't you think that such large scale reliance on e-technology can also hinder such initiatives of direct benefit transfer? So always think from this interlinkages perspective as well. Till now, 3.7 lakh crore plus rupees has been transferred under the provision of Kisan Samman Nidhi, and thus 11 crore registered farmer beneficiaries has been achieved. Use this data in your GS3 issues related to direct and indirect farm subsidies. Don't you think such large scale expenditure by the government will also act as a kind of a dent to the fiscal health? We will not be able to achieve our fiscal deficit target. So keep these issues in your mind as well. Use them in financial inclusion as well as in your GS4 ethical issues which are arising due to the e-governance. Also, Kisan Credit Card by the same ministry. The nature it is majorly implemented by the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. The objective was for timely and hassle-free short-term credit to the farmers for crop cultivation and allied activities, and thus it provides a kind of a revolving credit facility with kind of a flexible withdrawal, working capital for allied activities, and interest subvention benefit as well. Till now, 7 crore active Kisan credit card accounts have been issued, and the article specifically mentioned that how it has propelled the agriculture export past the 5 lakh crore mark. Use them in GS3 issues related to direct and indirect farm subsidies as well as the issue of financial inclusion. Now, if a question is coming on gender equality, gender equity and women empowerment this year, you people have two major schemes to quote, Ujjwala scheme as well as Lakhpati Didi campaign, keep this in mind. If the issue is talking about e-governance projects, like for example Kisan Samman Nidhi, where the direct benefit transfer mechanism has been involved, does it has a built-in bias towards technology? Yes, it has. What if there does not take place large-scale internet penetration in the rural areas, right? Or explain the factor influencing the decision of the farmer on the selection of high-value crops in India. Don't you think because of the schemes by the government, like for example Kisan Samman Nidhi and Kisan Credit Card, the credit is very easily accessible to the farmers. Their household expenditure is being taken care by the Kisan Samman Nidhi. Don't you think these initiatives by the government itself is propelling them to actually, kind of look towards high-value crops as well? So these are the interlinkages, and we move forward to the next news, where we'll quickly try to understand about the election process which takes place in Rajya Sabha. Why? Because after urging the Election Commission of India to set aside the rejection of the nomination of the Congress Rajya Sabha candidate from the Madhya Pradesh, Meenakshi Natarajan, the Congress party is set to move the Supreme Court against the decision. So what is this rejection of the nomination to kind of fight as a Rajya Sabha candidate? Why that took place for this candidate from Congress party, that was Meenakshi Natarajan? Let's try to understand that. Under the provisions of Representation of People Act of 1951 and Conduct of Election Rules of 1961. So basically, Meenakshi Natarajan's candidature was actually rejected by the returning officer or RO on the account of hidden details of the case registered against her in the Hyderabad. However, Congress has basically brought out some arguments, right? Specifically citing the sections of RPA 1951, which you people shall remember. First is section 33A, where the Congress said that the section 33A tells us that the candidate is required to disclose only those cases that have punishment of more than 2 years, or if there has been charges already framed. But the case which is being discussed by the returning officer in the case of Meenakshi Natarajan, under that no specific charges has been framed against her. Then section 36 clause 2 and article 84 of the constitution, it basically provides only one kind of a condition to be eligible enough to become the Rajya Sabha member, right? One is obviously that you shall be the citizen of India. Second is that the candidate shall be at least 30 years old. Can you people list down what is the age bar, right? The age limit only above which you can actually contest the election for president. You can contest the election to become a prime minister, or you can contest the election to be the member of Lok Sabha, if you people can list down the required age for that. Then article 102 clause 1 of the constitution basically says that if a member will be disqualified to be eligible enough to become the member of Lok Sabha if that person holds office of profit, or is of unsound mind, or is considered as undischarged insolvent. The section 8 of RPA basically says that the conviction of offences, corrupt practices or failure to lodge the election expenses will eventually lead to the disqualification. Okay? So on these grounds only a person can be basically disqualified to fight the election as a member of Rajya Sabha. First and foremost, what is the importance of such Rajya Sabha election, right? Rajya Sabha is considered as a secondary house or a stepney in the parliament. Is that true? Let's try to see that. The first and foremost, the argument is that Rajya Sabha in many of the cases has equal status with Lok Sabha in a lot of cases, like for example, in introduction and passages of ordinary as well as constitutional amendment bill, or amending or passage of financial bill specifically under article 117 clause 3, in the election and impeachment of president, in removal of Chief Justice of India, judges of Supreme Court and High Court, as well as Chief Election Commissioner, in the approval to the ordinances which has been passed by the President under Article 123, or to actually approve the proclamation of all three type of emergencies. Keep this in mind, right? Your Article 352 National Emergency, 356 President Rule, as well as 360 that is Financial Emergency. Then Rajya Sabha has some special powers as well. For example, Article 67, Rajya Sabha alone can initiate the removal of Vice President. Under Article 249, Rajya Sabha can authorize the Parliament to make law on the state list as well. And under Article 312, it can authorize the Parliament to actually create a new All India Services. Remember, Rajya Sabha can approve all type of emergency if in the case Lok Sabha has been dissolved. However, In certain cases, Rajya Sabha also has a kind of a lower status in comparison to Lok Sabha. For example, the moment the money issue comes in, Rajya Sabha goes out. So Rajya Sabha, the money bill under Article 110 can be introduced only in Lok Sabha, and Rajya Sabha does not have any power to introduce any amendment to the money bill. It can only discuss it for 14 days, that's all. Whether the bill is money bill or not, that is basically testified and certified by the Speaker of Lok Sabha. Rajya Sabha can only discuss the budget but cannot vote on the demand for grants. Keep this in mind. Any resolution for the discontinuation of national emergency can be passed only by Lok Sabha, as well as Rajya Sabha does not hold the power to pass the non-confidence motion as well. How the election eventually takes place in Rajya Sabha? First and foremost, let's say if I am Meenakshi Natarajan and I want to contest the election for Rajya Sabha, right? The candidate fielded by political parties should be proposed by at least 10 members of that particular state assembly, or 10% of the party strength in the house. Okay? So let's assume, right, all these members of Rajya Sabha, they are basically indirectly elected by the already elected member. Remember, elected, not nominated. Elected member of Legislative Assembly and Union Territories through two mechanisms. One is single transferable vote, and the second is system of proportional representation. We'll try to understand them one by one. So let's say, for example, there exist two parties in the state of Madhya Pradesh where the election of Meenakshi Natarajan in the Rajya Sabha was going to take place. There is party A, which has 70 seats. Let's say this party is BJP, right? Or in this case, it can be considered as, let's say, for example, party A. Then there is party B, which has 30 seats. Let's say, for example, that is Congress. So when the voting takes place, right, each and every person, right, the elected member of Legislative Assembly in the state of Madhya Pradesh, that particular person has one vote, which he is going to transfer, right, to the particular candidate which he is kind of supporting at that point of a time. But here it does not contain that, okay, there is one vote which is given to one person, right, allotted to one person. Rather, each and every person can actually vote in the order of preference. So for example, let's say there exist 5 candidates. One of them is Meenakshi Natarajan, who is candidate C. One is candidate A and one is candidate B. Okay? So now the idea is that, let's say, for example, the total number of votes which can be polled from the state of Madhya Pradesh, that is 100. The total number of seats which are available in this case, right, that is 3 seats, right? So what we do, we take 100, we divide it by 3 plus 1, so that becomes 25. Then you add 1 into that and multiply it by 100. So totally one vote which is being kind of given by the MLA of Madhya Pradesh will have a value of 2600. Take it. The simple point is that, let's say, for example, to actually get elected to Rajya Sabha from this particular assembly which has 100 members, a particular candidate requires 26 votes. So in this case, let's say the candidate A, he basically got 26 first preference vote by the 26 party members. Take it. This person gets elected. Now from this party member, 70 members were there, 26 have already given their first preference to candidate A. So now there are remaining the remaining members who are remaining, they are approximately 44. Okay? Out of this 44, another 26 members put their first preference to the candidate B. That person also gets elected. Now out of remaining 44, right, there are only 18 persons who are remaining in the party who can give their first preference to any other person. In this case, the second party, which has got 30 members, they can actually give their 26 first preference to their candidate, which was Meenakshi Natarajan. And thus the ultimate election which will take place from Rajya Sabha will be in the proportion to the number of seats which are held by the parties in the Legislative Assembly. So if a party had 70-30, like party A had 70 seats and party B had 30 seats, the ratio was 7:3, right? Or you can write it as 2:1. And just look at the number of candidates which got elected. It is in the direct proportional representation of the number of seats in Rajya Sabha. Keep this particular election procedure in your mind. Take it. It can be asked in your prelims examination, and we move forward to the next news, where we'll quickly try to learn about a very prominent historical personality, and that is Birsa Munda. Keep this in mind that very recently, the death anniversary of Birsa Munda was being celebrated. That was on the June 9. However, his birth anniversary is celebrated on the date of 15th of November, right, where he was born in the year of 1875, died at a very young age of 1899 at the age of 24 to 25 years, where he was born Uli Hatu in the Jharkhand. And that our current government basically celebrates as Janjatiya Gaurav Divas. Keep this in your mind. Take it. What is the context? So on June 9, the death anniversary of iconic Adivasi leader and freedom fighter Birsa Munda, several tribal organizations in the Jharkhand actually took a pledge to protect his legacy. This pledge came amid the fresh demand for delisting or removing tribal converts to Christianity or Islam from the scheduled tribe list. That has reignited a long-running debate over the original Adivasi identity. All of this demand was actually raised at a tribal gathering which was also attended by our Honorable Home Minister. So first and foremost, who is Birsa Munda and what is the pivotal role which he played in one of the very important subaltern revolt which he led from the region of the current day Jharkhand? For that purpose, first we need to understand a Sardar agitation which was taking place from the year of 1857 onwards. So by the year of, let's say for example, 1849, after your specific battle of Gujarat, which took place in the year of 1849, basically the Britishers ended up subjugating the last standing empire in our country, and that was the Sikh empire of Ranjit Singh. And thus the Britishers basically emerged as the paramount political power in our country. This took place under a Governor General of India at that point of a time, who was Lord Dalhousie. Lord Dalhousie, just 2 years down the line in the year of 1851, ended up establishing the Geological Survey of India for the mineral exploration in our country. Why? Because Britishers wanted iron, coal to run their trains, to actually penetrate into the large-scale tribal forest, to cut down the very important timber, the timber which they will eventually use to lay down the sleeper lines for the railways. The penetration of railways which will basically provide them two advantages. One, to take out the raw materials and basically export it to their countries for their industries of Lancashire, Manchester, London, etc. And also to actually bring their products into our country and make the penetration of that products into the hinterlands of our country. Ye clear? Thus, with this large-scale penetration of outsiders, that was Britishers, started taking place into the tribal domains. Why? Because they want timber. They want various kind of natural vegetation resources. They also started forcing these tribal communities to actually settle down in an area. Why? So that they can collect a uniform revenue from that under various revenue policies like permanent settlement system, Raiyatwari system, Mahalwari system, etc. Also, they started, kind of enforcing a system which was called as Bait Bagari or forced labor on these tribal communities, where these tribals were basically captured by the European planters and used to make them work as a coolie on a very minimal cost, sometime as a forced labor in their plantation sites of tea, jute, rubber, etc. Thus, against these foreign kind of extortion, exploitation, there was already a movement which was being led by the tribal communities such as, for example, Munda and Oraon tribes, which were fighting against these outsiders which they termed as Diku or foreign invasion. Look at the creativity of the Britishers. They borrowed this term of Diku from the tribals and called these tribals as Dakus. So this specific Sardar movement for their Mulk Ki Ladai was actually provided a leadership by a person called as Gideon of Pyring, where they were fighting for what? For the loss of their ancestral right as Sardar, for the abolishment of this Bait Begari or forced labor as well as the Zamindari system. However, remember that was largely non-violent in the nature, where they followed a kind of a 3P model which was followed by the moderates as well. The 3P model being prayer, protest and petition. Ultimately, Birsa Munda, right, who was eventually, first he was converted to Christianity, started going to Christian schools, started learning New Testaments, right, all of that. But ultimately, he was brought back to the fold of Hinduism, where he converted back to the Hinduism under a Vaishnava preacher whose name is called as Anand Panrai. Thus, he joined this Sardar agitation or Mulk Ki Ladai in the year of 1895 after he had a divine intervention, where he changed the entire nature of this tribal revolt which was taking place by bringing various socio-religious reform, where he called upon these tribals to give up animal sacrifice, wear a sacred thread, stop taking intoxicants like for example tadi, etc. And thus establishing a faith which is called as Birsayat or Sarnaism, and took a title of Dharti Abba, right, or the father of the motherland, and created a kind of a war against the church and Christian missionaries and all the Dikus or the foreigners like for example Thekedar, Jagirdar, Rajas, Hakim, Zamidars, etc. Ultimately refused to pay taxes under the permanent settlement system. Small question here. Who introduced permanent settlement system in our country? Just use the knowledge from your lecture of modern history. And kind of created a coalition of tribes of Oraon, Jatra and Munda in this region which you guys can see, Manibham, Singhbham, Rachi, Khunti, Palamu, etc. Ultimately gave a call, Abua Raj Ete Jana, Maharani Raj Tundu Jana, that now the kind of the kingdom of tribes is going to be established and the kingdom of Queen Victoria is going to be abolished. Fought a battle of Tanga River 1897 where for the first time the tribals actually ended up defeating the Britishers. On the date of 25th of December 1899, gave the call for a great tumult to all these tribes, calling for a Ulugulan which took place in Khunti, Tamar, Basia, Rachi. On a specific date of 7th of January 1900, there was an attack on Khunti police station took place where they actually tried to capture the arms and ammunition. And thus the district magistrate of the region of Jharkhand at that point of time, A. Forbes, basically gave the order to capture Munda dead or alive, and ultimately he was captured on 3rd of February 1900 and arrested in the Chakradharpur. Keep this in mind that as per the British official records, he died in the prison because he was suffering from cholera. But the historians dispute on this fact that maybe he was poisoned by the Britishers. But because of this large-scale Ulugulan or great tumult which was caused by the Munda or Birsa Munda specifically, it led to the passing of Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act by the Britishers in 1908 after the decades of Adivasi resistance, including the Birsa Munda uprising, to actually protect the customary land rights in the Chota Nagpur region. The central objective was to prevent the transfer of this Adivasi land into the non-Adivasis, which basically were these Dikus, right? The act remains one of the strongest safeguards for tribal lands in Jharkhand. Keep all of these facts very dear to you from the perspective of prelims, and we move forward to the next news, where we'll try to cover some federal issues which are actually emerging in the higher education sector as highlighted by the today's editorial in the Hindu. What is the context of the news? The article basically put emphasis on the growing influence of the center, where several developments have actually illustrated this growing federal tension between the center and the state government. In Tamil Nadu, for example, the state government repeatedly opposed the various aspects of national education policy of 2020, particularly the 3-language formula as well as the University Grants Commission circular on the 3rd language this year. Another major issue is the dispute over the appointment of Vice Chancellor and the power of governors which takes place in the state of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka and West Bengal. Keep this in mind that today's editorial itself highlights that although education remains constitutionally within the concurrent list, the prevailing governance dynamic increasingly favors the union. So first and foremost, what is this 3-language formula? Let's try to understand that. It was actually devised by the Kothari Commission in the year of 1964-66 to actually promote the national integration and multilingual proficiency, where a 3-language mechanism was created. One, where the student will be taught in their own regional language or mother language, let's say Marathi or Tamil for example, right, or Kannada, Salpa Salpa Kannada Gottu. Second, Hindi or English depending upon the region. Third, any other Indian or foreign language, right, let's say for example French in that case. Thus, this 3-language formula was ultimately implemented in the first national education policy which came into the force in the year of 1968. Other key recommendation from the Kothari Commission was to actually create a kind of a neighborhood grid-based school system which shall be within the vicinity of 5 to 5 km square grid, or to create a 10+2+3 structure which is largely followed even today. For the first 10 years you are basically taught general studies, then you do 2 years of specialization course like for example PCB or PCM, and ultimately followed by a 3 year of college system. to actually develop research institution and scientific temper in you, right? At that point of a time, obviously, this Instagram Reels and TikTok, all of that did not existed. And to actually increase public spending on the education up to 6% of GDP, a target which actually remains aloof even today. Second issue which is being discussed is the appointment of Vice Chancellor. Let's try to understand that. So first and foremost, because of the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1976, it actually ended up shifting the education from the state list to the concurrent list. Thus, kind of providing the central government to intervene and kind of regulate the state universities. Thus, as per the University Grant Commission Regulation of 2025, the appointment of vice chancellors, even in the state universities, will actually take place by the central government, where these vice chancellors will eventually be appointed by the chancellor of this state university. Now, who is this chancellor of state university? Let's try to understand that. So, in the Central Universities Act 2009, president is considered to be the visitor of a central university. When president visits any central university, he by default becomes the de facto chancellor, right, or the de jure chancellor. It is up to the president to, in that capacity, to appoint chancellor of universities as well as vice chancellor, and also to direct for the inspection of academic and non-academic aspect. As per the UGC regulation of 2018, the governor in the same capacity act as a ex officio chancellor of state universities. And as per the new act, who is going to appoint the vice chancellor? It is going to be appointed by the governor itself. Governor in this case can also act independently without the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, and thus can appoint the vice chancellor. Remember, as per Article 254 Clause 1, if there takes place any tussle between the concurrent list item and the union list item, it is always the union law which prevails. Is clear? So for appointment of such vice chancellor, there will be a search cum selection committee which will take place. Again, there is no specific criteria to be part of this committee. Don't you think it eventually erodes the state authority in higher education and pave way for excessive centralization? So it basically leads to what? A kind of a dual authority syndrome in the state universities, where there is a vice chancellor which is directly, kind of answerable to the governor which is directly responsible to the center. The universities on the other side are the state subject, where the state actually bears 76% of their total expenditure on education, but majority of the administrative decisions will be taken by the vice chancellor here, thus creating a kind of a governance vacuum where governors increasingly withhold assent or delay the academic appointments, creating what a kind of a federal friction in the higher education, where governor is appointed by the center but universities are funded and run by the state. And the courts are now being asked as a kind of a conflict manager, where Supreme Court increasingly steps in to resolve the routine administrative deadlocks which takes place. So remember this specific issue and the appointment, as well as some salient features of National Education Policy of 2020 as well, where it created 3-language formula as devised by Kothari Commission. 2 of them shall be native languages to strengthen the linguistic diversity. Put impetus on mother tongue or regional language, which shall be taught at least till class 5 and preferably till class 8. To further create Indian Institute of Translation and Interpretation. To promote traditional values like yoga, Ayurveda, Nyaya, classical math and language, as well as dedicate a research funding for the classical language. Keep these provisions in your mind and we move forward to the last news of the day, where we'll quickly try to learn about some recent trends which has emerged in the foreign direct investments in our country. What is the context? So India's net FDI, as per the article today, has declined drastically in the recent year. Critics basically see this as the weak net flow as a sign of weakness, while the chief economic advisor to the country points out the large inflow and rising manufacturing FDI as the evidence of strength. He links this weak net flow to profit repatriation and outward investment which is also being done by the Indian companies, because to actually calculate this net FDI, we basically kind of minus the total FDI which we have received. We minus from that the total outflow of the FDI which takes place. So now the chief economic advisor is saying that the outward FDI has also been increased from our country. However, this debate overlooks a major issue, that is, by focusing on overall number, both sides ignore the changing composition of international capital and the balance of payment mechanism that has actually started taking place. First and foremost, what is the recent trend in FDI? So India's net FDI inflow in the month of February was $4.6 billion net, which was highest since the year of May 2022, where the net inflow was $5.3 billion. Remember, Why this inflow suddenly increased in our country? Because USA ended up eliminating a penal 25% tariff. In the year of fiscal year 25, India's net FDI inflow was less than $1 billion. Also, the highest FDI in our country comes from which country? Singapore, then USA, and then Mauritius. The today's article basically puts impetus that there exist three kind of FDIs which people shall know about and their share. First and foremost, what is the difference between FDI and FPI? FDI basically talks about direct ownership of a business or asset, where investors seek significant control over the company. Typically, the investment is in the long terms for years or decades, and thus generally it is considered as higher risk due to the involvement in the local economy. But it leads to what? Creation of job, transfer technology, boost economic growth. Foreign portfolio investment in sharp contrast is the purchase of financial asset, where the investor has low or little control over the company. Typically shorter term, but generally considered lower risk because they can basically withdraw their FPIs at any given point of time. But they provide the capital for companies and contribute to the market liquidity. As per the today's article, the FDI can be very kind of characteristically divided into three components, three different investor class. First is the multinational companies, which basically kind of do large term investment, bring their technology, brand to establish production and services. So they are basically in the nature of long-term capital investment. That contributes to 42% of effective inflow. Earlier, this share was quite higher. Second is financial investors, like for example, private equity funds, venture capital firms, sovereign wealth funds, or asset manager, where they basically focus on a little bit capital gain which they can get and then have a planned exit. This share has significantly increased in the recent years, 40% of the effective inflow. Then there comes investments from diaspora, which is basically the capital which is raised abroad and funneled through the offshore financial centers, like for example round tripping which takes place. So for example, instead of directly investing in Indian company, they create a, let's say for example, a shell company in other country where they can have a kind of a benefit of tax haven countries, 0% capital gain tax. From there they make investment in our country. 18% of effective inflow comes from this direction. Keep this in mind. Remember the difference between FDI and FPI. Remember the different kind of FDIs which exist and their share in the net effective outflow. And with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion. Before that, just try to solve these questions which we have discussed right now. Do it purely from your memory application. Comment down the answer. And with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.